These are some Ohlins forks from a 748R. They're, I guess you'd call them the early style internally, which you'll see when we pull them apart. Leaking fork seals, not uncommon. There is a revision on the fork scraper on Ohlins forks a few years ago, and the revised scraper has a spring on the outside and it ends in 0.3 instead of 0.1, and that's what I usually use. Ohlins call it a street tension scraper, and I must say that the number of Ohlins fork seals I've been replacing in the last few years has dropped dramatically. I used to sell heaps of Ohlins fork seals, but I just don't go through them like I used to. So forks out of the bike, the preload, because the blue nut has been wound off, the compression and rebound adjusters. On this one, the compression adjuster's down here, rebound is in the middle of the preload adjuster. 748R fork is a FG8500, and in the Ohlins spec sheets, that's the number you use to work out what the oil level's meant to be, what the spare parts are. To get the cap off, multi-prong tool, which is, has got a part number on it? No part number. It's a bit strange. Anyway, it's the Ohlins multi-prong tool. If you're doing a lot of these, you buy the tools, because it's just so much easier. But if not, just use some sort of pin tool and be careful. Inside these forks, this is the early style, I would call them. So they have this big sleeve here, which is the spring preload tube. In the bottom it has a plastic piece with a small diameter around the shaft. So you need to pull the nut off that locks this on to get this off. Then into 17mm open end spanner. Pull the sleeve down, and just in there's the nut. So put the spanner on the nut. 17mm socket on the preload adjuster. The blue anodizing on these adjusters can be a bit dodgy, and I thought once I would put tape on it to protect it from the tool, and all that happened was the tape pulled all the blue anodizing off, which really disappointed me. What often happens is, when you loosen these, I've loosened it and screwed now a bit and now it's stopped. The nut has wound itself all the way down to the bottom of the thread and stopped, and that's because the cap itself is bottomed out on the top of the damper rod or the cartridge rod, and that's what happens with these. When they go together, you wind it down till this bottoms out on top of the thread, and then you bring the nut up and tighten it up. So that's our preload tube. It obviously won't come off. So again, we pull it down to expose the nut, which is now jammed on the bottom of its thread. At this point, I get a big pair of pliers, very gently grab hold of the top of the cartridge rod, and the nut will just crack. There we go. Spin the nut off. Preload tube comes out. This is the rebound adjuster rod. On these ones, which have an aluminium cartridge rod instead of later ones have steel, the hole in the middle is only that size. So the rebound adjuster and its spring don't come out of the end of this. On the later ones, 999, S4RS, 1098, that sort of thing, this tube is steel, it's much bigger internally, and there's a spring and a little brass needle inside here, which is the adjuster that sits down here. And this big long tube presses on that. So when you turn these ones upside down, nothing falls out of them. On the later ones with the steel rod, something will fall out. So we'll tip it up and get the oil and the spring out. On the Ohlins, the inner just slides out of the outer because the bushes are both in here. There's a bush here and a bush up here. I'm going to replace the bush at the bottom just because these forks to get the bush out of the fork. I'm going to use a slide hammer with the 2 prongs on it. So I just this in here. The most important part of this operation, well, you need a good tool. Make sure your tool's good for the job. But the most important part is the heat. And I'm going to give it 30 seconds. Well, I'm going to count to 30, and then it should just come out really easily. But the heat is the really important part. You don't want to heat things too hot, because when you heat anodized aluminium really hot, the surface cracks and it gets a crazed finish about it, and it kind of looks really bad. And once it's done that, it's rooted, you can't ever fix it. So hopefully the bush should just come out. Bush out. There we go. So heat is always your friend in this situation. Back for reassembly, everything's been washed. I usually wash them in the parts washer first to knock all the gunk and grease and oil and stuff off. And then you can use naphtha, which is white spirit, or shellite, or maybe even kerosene. Or if you use, a lot of people will probably use brake cleaner, which you can buy at most sort of parts stores. Brake clean tends to really dry everything off, whereas the naphtha tends to leave a little bit of an oily film. Up to you. Give it all a good blow off when you're done. Things like the compression pistons, just give them a good wash and a good blow off. Get all the gunk out of them. When I was filming the disassembly, the camera died. I got as far as pulling the outer off the fork leg. So I'll talk about pulling it apart as I put it back together. First thing we do is put the cartridge in the leg. This is the compression piston that I pulled out. When I put it back in, I usually drop it in the oil, oil the O-ring up, and then just gently work it into the end of the leg. It should just work its way in, and there it goes. To get that out, use a little sharp screwdriver in the gap and just lever it up. And then you just gently pull it out, and it will come out freely to some point, then it'll stop and you need to wiggle it around a bit. But just gently get them out. They always come out. The Ohlins get really, really gunky. So you need to pull all this stuff apart and give it a good clean. Ohlins are much worse than any other fork I've ever seen in terms of building up the grey, sludgy gunk, which realistically is bits of aluminium, I guess. So to put this back in, drop the bottom in the oil, oil the threads up, and then drop it in the leg. Same tool as removal. This is the 4-prong tool. And just drop this tool in. There's no part number. I was looking for a part number when I disassembled them, but there's no part number on the tool. But it's just an Ohlins tool. Drop that in. Wind it in until it stops. They don't need to be overly tight. Just hip it up. That's the 4 holes there that the tool is going over. Okay. I've got my 2 columns of bits lined up. When I'm doing fork legs, I usually line all the bits up in 2 columns so that when I'm putting them back together again, if I look at a column and realise the part there that shouldn't be there, that should be in there, I know where it is. Because there's no point having parts on the bench when you're finished and then trying to work out which fork leg they came out of. It's horrendous. The first thing to go in is the bushings that are replaced. You probably wouldn't always replace these. I've done these because these forks are done 80-odd thousand Ks and they looked a bit worn. The seal driver to knock it in with. I'm going to heat the tube up, which should make it much easier to go in. All around the outside of the bush, help it slide in. Oh, look at that, it just fell in. Didn't need to hit it at all, which is nice. I like not having to hit things. Okay, next up on our, oops, I'm taking from the wrong lists. Next part in is the washer. And this washer has a sharp edge and a round edge. And traditionally the sharp edge goes to the seal, and the underside of it with the round edge is only supporting on its inner edge the bush. So it really doesn't matter about the round side being at the bottom, but you want the sharp edge at the top for the seal to sit against. And that just drops in like so. Seal. Put a little bit of oil around the outside of it, just to help it go in. And these generally, 43mm seal tool, these will generally just push in. The leg's hot too still, so it will probably just push all the way in. Quite straight. And give it a bit of a whack on the bench if you want to. But it goes in and there's a groove there that is exposed, and so the groove lets you know how far in it is. And the groove takes this clip This is what retains the seal. Now when you want to remove the seal at the start, with a flat bladed screwdriver, I actually just push the seal clip down and it does that. And that's how you remove it. That should be that easy. Well, it should be. Sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're really annoying, but that's how it comes apart. Next, I put the dust scraper in. Again, the scraper just pushes in. Maybe just a little bit of oil around the lip to help it. Should just be a finger job. There. To get the dust scrapers out, I use a plastic chisel usually to make it nice. I just put the chisel under there and lever it out. That way you don't mark anything, but generally they just lever out. They're only held in there by the ridges on the actual scraper itself. So that's the outer assembled. Now we can put the outer on the inner. To grease the seals up, I use this, which is Ohlins red grease. It is actually made in Australia. I don't know who makes it or where. Steve Kramer could never find out who made it or where, so it's obviously a fairly closely guarded secret. But this is the official Ohlins product. And so I just spread it around so the seals have a nice coating, seals and the scraper. Trying to get it onto the, well, wipe it off the bush. Just like to keep it on the seals and the scraper themselves. And then to put them on, it's just a wiggle. And this is one of those things that it's pretty easy to do, but it can also be quite daunting because some of the Marzocchis, the 40mm Marzocchis on the Super Sports and Monsters were a similar setup to these. And I have assembled them in the past and had the edge of the seal catch and pull over and then pour oil out and stuff. So just take your time. It's down. There's often a bit of red grease around the top of the tube. I just try and wipe it off with my finger, but it's not really going to worry anything. And that's the outer on. So next we put the fork oil in, and I don't actually have a spec for 8500s. I have a spec for 996 998 forks, which are 8850. I'm not sure what the difference actually is. I suspect they are exactly the same fork. But they say an oil level of 110mm with the springs out. So I'll go 110 with the springs out, which sounds a little bit high to me, but it's also about, I guess, a typical Ohlins spec. Some of the Ohlins are spec'd with the springs in, and that's because it's very hard to get it to that point with the springs out. I can't remember now. But there are some that will say in the Ohlins specs, measured with spring in. This one says measured with spring out. So I'll go up and down a bit. Don't go too far because just that catch you could hear there was the top bush coming off the top of the tube. So I try not to, you can lift it up if you like, so you're off the top bush, wiggle it around to get plenty of oil down between the inner tube and the outer tube, but just be wary of that. Don't bang it because you might damage the edge of the bush. Okay, and you can feel now that the oil's in there, it's just dropping. So now we cycle the cartridge rod to get the oil up and through everything. If you can't get them to pick up the oil, what you can do is lift the tube up a bit, like so, put your hand on top and push it down really harsh. What that does is pressurize the inside and push oil in places. And I've had that work. It might have been some of the old 851SP Ohlins that I couldn't get to bleed one day. They're really wacky, those 851 Ohlins. They're totally different. So we cycle up and down a few times. I usually go about 20 times all up to make sure you've got, and screw the nut back on top to make it easier. Just to make sure you've got all the air out. Okay, so we should have all the air out now. I would usually pop this rod back in before I do the oil level. There's a little bit of oil in the middle of the fork. You can, usually when that rod goes all the way down, you can push it up and down. And that's just the spring and the rebound adjuster, which in these cartridges are captive in that leg or go in from the bottom, I guess. I don't actually know. So now we'll do the oil level, and we're going for 110mm with the springs out. Yeah. Actually, the oil volume spec is 520 mils, so yeah. As I say, I probably had about 520 or so in it, so I pulled a little bit out, which is convenient. So next the spring goes in. Pull the cartridge up. I'll try and get the preload tube on like this. Yep. Okay, and there's our nut on. There's plenty of oil on the thread. It's good. So just wind the nut down until it hits the bottom of the thread. There we go. And that way, when the cap screws on, it will screw all the way down till the cartridge rod bottoms out inside the center of the preload adjuster there. Put some oil on the caps. You want to oil the O-ring and the thread. Up. Just wind it down. It's just stopped there. There's a small gap between the nut and the cap, and that's enough friction just to wind it up. And now the nut's up against the bottom of the cap. 17mm spanner. Nipped up. There we go. When you wind the preload adjuster down, it pushes this down, like so. That's how it preloads the spring. Outer up. Grab our special tool. When these go on the bike, I usually give them just a little bit of a nip, but they don't need to be tight. The top triple clamp, when it clamps, will hold the cap in place. Just wipe some of the red grease off. You get a bit of red grease everywhere. That's fine. And that's fork tube assembled. And luckily, all the parts are in it. I always check just to make sure. I'll give it a quick bounce on the ground. My usual test of oil height is how far you can compress the fork leg under my weight when I bounce it. If you can't get it down very far, then the oil's too high. I'm a bit suspicious of 110, but we'll see what happens. That's pretty good. I can get it almost to the bottom. That's fine. And on these, the adjusters were 12 clicks and 12 clicks out, and it had 9.5 turns, or 10 turns of preload. So the preload, there's a little soft and hard, and a snot mark there, but all the way anti-clockwise is soft, and you wind it on. So I'll wind it down 10 turns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and where's the outer? It's been turning on me. 10. So 3mm hex key, wind the adjuster all the way clockwise. It's like a tap. You're turning it off. When it stops, just be gentle. Okay, and then wind it out 12 clicks. 1, 2, 3, 6, and 6 clicks is a turn, so that's 2 turns out. 9, 10, 11, 12. And the compression adjuster, oops, on the bottom of these forks, just here. Again, wind it in until it stops, and then come out 12 clicks. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There we go. Fork leg done. I think I forgot to mention the oil I'm using. The oil I'm using is Ohlins 1309, which is just the Ohlins oil spec for these forks. It is I think they call it a 7 weight, but it's 19 center stokes at 40 degrees. Some people like to use the Maxima 5, which is 15. So that any oil in that 15 to 20 CST at 40 degree range should be fine.